maybe we could go into a little bit more depth on the ESA itself. Its very nature, in fact, as a big idea, if you will, has some very vague aspects, such as the significant portion of range as an aspect of it. Can you explain why such vagary was necessary in this monumental act, and why such details as the definition of significant portion of range is such a big deal?
Yeah, I think as a lawmaker, I've come to recognize and respect and understand that sometimes the laws that we write that consider very big ideas have to be written in vague terms, because the idea is so big that you simply can't account for all circumstances that might arise, all circumstances that will arise when you're first writing the law. As an example, we just passed, in 2009, I was a principal author of the nation's most sweeping law concerning geologic sequestration of carbon in an attempt to usher in a new energy future where we better manage CO2 emissions. Well, we can't account for all of the things that are going to come up with a sequestration program for CO2. The fact of the matter is we're not even sequestering carbon in Montana right now in no purposeful manner. So how in the world can we anticipate, when we're writing this law, all of the things that will come up when we get into a very active program of carbon sequestration? So for the Endangered Species Act way back in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when the country says we will no longer allow for, we will now actively work to stop extinctions. The extinction crisis is just that, a massive crisis. We as a country will stand in opposition, and nothing will disappear on our watch. And that was the fundamental sort of intellectual aim of the Endangered Species Act. But there had been no law prior to the late 60s and early 70s. The Endangered Species Act actually went through three iterations, and what we work under right now is the third iteration. But in the late 60s and early 70s, no country had ever purposely gone out and said we will now work proactively to prevent extinctions. And so by the very nature of the big problem, they simply couldn't anticipate all of the twists and turns that the implementers, that the field biologists and administrators would encounter as they implement the Endangered Species Act. So they've got some language that's a bit broad, some language that's not defined, because at the time I would guess that they simply understood that we can't account for everything. Moreover, people that wrote the law were just that. They were just people, and they're sitting there, and they probably thought that their work was very clear, and they had covered all of the bases, only to find out 20, 25 years, 30 years later, gee whiz, some of the things aren't quite so clear. And laws, like anything else, have to be improved over time, or they simply don't get better. So, for example, in the Endangered Species Act, a very important word, range, is not defined. An endangered species is any species likely to become extinct in the foreseeable future throughout all or a significant portion of its range. That's the definition that appears in the Endangered Species Act. And yet nowhere do they define the word range. So were they referring to current range? Were they referring to historic range? Were they referring to prehistoric range? We're smart enough that we can look at the earthly record and know something about what was going on 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 years ago. Even we can go deeper into time. We can know a great deal about what was happening in the last 100 years, 200 years, 300 years. So historic range is something we can understand. Prehistoric range is something that we can understand. And, of course, we can understand current range. We can, through field studies, know where a species currently exists. So the word range is not defined. But when you read the congressional record and you look at the policies that the United States Fish and Wildlife Service have developed in response to the Endangered Species Act, it's clear that the most common sense interpretation of the word range is historic range. We're not typically worrying about conditions 10,000 years ago, and we're not hamstrung by just worrying about current range conditions, but rather we're wondering what were the historic ranges of these species, and can something be restored to a manner that's consistent with historic range. Typically, historic ranges begin in 1492. 1492 to present would constitute historic conditions. 1491 and before would constitute something other than historic conditions. So, Tom, another very, very important part of the Act, when you think about definitions, is these two words, significant portion. An endangered species is any species that is likely to become extinct in the foreseeable future throughout all or a significant portion of range. They didn't define range, they being the authors of the Act, and they didn't define significant portion. Significant from a spatial perspective, that makes sense. That would mean that you've got to connect to, your recovery work has to connect to at least 51% of the species historic range, because 51%, I think in the minds of everybody, would be more significant than 49%, 52 more significant than 48, 53% more significant than 47, and on and on and on. So you can easily imagine a spatial component, but when you read the Act, it's clear that there probably is also an ecological component to significant portion of range. The gray wolf, a very good example, occurred throughout the United States historically, and the U.S. would present to the gray wolf many different ecological settings. Northern Minnesota, where gray wolves occur, is the northern boreal forest. Okay, that's a very different setting than a southwestern desert grassland where you could find gray wolves historically. Very different yet again from montane rangelands in the Rocky Mountains. Very different ecological setting, and yet gray wolves occurred there. Very different than the forests of the Pacific Northwest, and yet gray wolves occurred there. So we as restoration ecologists have to wrestle with the notion, okay, what is range and what is significant portion? And those three words, significant portion of range, actually four words, significant portion of range, is an important part of how we try to affect recovery, trying to understand what the original authors of the Endangered Species Act meant. And I think they purposely gave us some latitude to try to figure it out on a case-by-case, species-by-species basis.